The soft hum of the organ filled the grand hall, its notes rising and falling like waves of quiet excitement. The church was adorned in shades of ivory and gold. White roses lined the aisle, their fragrance mingling with the faint scent of polished wood and candle wax. Every pew was occupied, guests shifting slightly, whispering behind polite smiles, waiting for the moment the bride would make her entrance. Outside the tall arched doors, sunlight filtered through the stained glass, painting the floor with patches of color. The day couldn't have been more perfect. A calm blue sky, a gentle breeze, and a sense of something sacred in the air. The kind of day people imagined when they thought of happily ever after. Inside, the groom, Jake, stood at the altar in his black suit, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His best man nudged him playfully, whispering, "Nervous?" Jake only smiled, but there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes that betrayed how deeply he felt this moment. Nervous, maybe, but more than that, he was in awe. Today, he was marrying the woman who had changed his entire life. In the crowd, whispers fluttered softly like the rustling of silk. Old friends leaned in to exchange small talk, some dabbing at their eyes with tissues even before the ceremony began. Others looked toward the back, waiting for the first glimpse of the bride. The anticipation was thick, not just the joyful kind, but the curious kind too. Everyone knew what had happened a year ago. The accident. It wasn't the kind of thing that stayed a secret in a small community. One evening drive, a slick road, a single moment that changed everything. Emily, the bride-to-be, had spent months recovering. There had been hospital visits, surgeries, therapy sessions, and a long silence on social media that made people wonder if the wedding would even happen. But here they were. The wedding hadn't been postponed. It was happening, despite everything. In the bridal suite, Emily sat in front of a full-length mirror, her white gown spilling around her like a cloud. The dress had been altered 3 times to accommodate her healing leg. It fit perfectly now, but she still couldn't shake the fear that she'd stumble. Her reflection showed the same woman she used to be, yet she felt changed, fragile in body but stronger in soul. Her maid of honor adjusted the veil gently. "You look beautiful," she whispered. Emily smiled faintly. "I just hope I make it down the aisle without tripping." "Jake won't care," the maid of honor replied, squeezing her hand. "You're here. That's what matters." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath. She could hear the faint music from the hall, the sound of guests settling, the priest's low voice preparing for the ceremony. Her heart pounded. This was the moment she had dreamed of, and feared. She reached for her bouquet, her fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't just a walk down the aisle. For her, it was a walk through everything she had survived. Each step would be a silent declaration. "I'm still here. I made it." The music shifted. The organist began the familiar chords of the bridal march. The double doors creaked open slightly as the usher signaled it was time. Emily stood, steadying herself. The world outside the doors waited. A sea of faces, some filled with love, others with curiosity. The doors opened wide. Light poured in. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Emily appeared, framed in sunlight, her veil glimmering like mist. For a moment, no one breathed. The whispers began, soft, uncertain, filled with pity and awe. But Emily didn't hear them. Her gaze locked on Jake, standing tall at the end of the aisle. His smile, gentle, unwavering, and was all she needed. The anticipation that filled the church wasn't just for a ceremony. It was for a story, one that would soon silence every whisper in that room. Behind her calm smile and steady gaze, Emily carried a secret weight heavier than her lace gown. To everyone watching, she was a radiant bride, a picture of grace and courage. But beneath that perfection was a woman fighting a quiet, invisible battle, one that began the night everything changed. It had been almost a year since the accident. She could still remember the sound, the screech of tires, the blinding headlights, the sickening crunch of metal. One moment she was driving home from work, humming along to the radio, and the next her world was pain and flashing red lights. She woke up days later in a hospital bed, unable to feel her left leg properly. The doctors had spoken gently, but their words carried finality. Her leg would heal, but never completely. There would be surgeries, scars, and a limp that might never fade. At first, Emily refused to believe it. She was 27, young, full of plans. She was supposed to dance at her wedding. to walk down the aisle with her father proudly by her side. Instead, she spent months in physical therapy, relearning how to stand, to take one careful step at a time. Each movement was a victory, but also a reminder of what she had lost. The pain wasn't just physical, it was emotional, deep, and relentless. There were nights she cried silently, staring at the crutches leaning against her wall, wondering if Jake would still love her the same way. He had proposed before the accident when everything was still perfect. She couldn't shake the fear that now maybe he pitied her more than he loved her, but Jake had never wavered. He visited her every day, bringing laughter into hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and sadness. He'd tell her stories about their future, their home, their travels, the family they'd build. "We'll get through this," he would say, holding her hand as though sheer belief could heal her. "You're still you, Em. Nothing changes that." Still, Emily couldn't silence the doubt in her heart. She avoided mirrors that showed her full body. She declined invitations, unwilling to let anyone see her limp. The woman she used to be, confident, graceful, free, felt like someone she had lost in that crash. When Jake suggested they keep the original wedding date, Emily hesitated. "Everyone will stare," she said softly one night. "They'll see how broken I am." Jake took her face in his hands, his eyes full of sincerity. "You're not broken," he said. "You're brave. I don't care if you limp, crawl, or fly. I just want you there with me." Those words stayed with her. They were what carried her through therapy sessions when her body screamed in protest. They were what pushed her to stand, to walk, to keep moving forward even when every step hurt. And now, here she was, standing in her wedding gown, her leg aching beneath layers of silk and lace. She had practiced this walk for weeks, counting her steps, training her balance. Yet, as she looked down at her trembling hands clutching the bouquet, she wondered, would everyone see her love, or would they only see her limp? A knock came at the door. Her father stepped in, his eyes misty with pride. "Ready, sweetheart?" Emily smiled faintly, though her heart raced. "As ready as I'll ever be." He offered his arm, steady and strong, and she took it. Her fingers tightened around his sleeve as they walked toward the church doors. The sound of the organ reached her ears again, soft, grand, and full of promise. For a moment her fears whispered louder than the music. But then she saw Jake waiting at the altar, his expression so full of love that it drowned out every doubt. Maybe her steps wouldn't be perfect. Maybe her walk wouldn't be graceful. But she realized something then. This wasn't about perfection. It was about love that never limped even when she did. And with that thought, Emily took her first step toward the aisle, her pain hidden behind the quiet strength of her smile. The great wooden doors of the church creaked open and a hush swept through the room. Every head turned. Every whisper died. There she was, Emily, framed by sunlight pouring in from behind her, her veil shimmering like mist. For a brief, breathtaking moment, the room seemed suspended in stillness. She looked angelic, her white gown cascading in soft folds, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. But then as she took her first step down the aisle, the silence fractured. The faint click of her heel echoed across the marble floor, followed by another uneven step. Her limp was subtle, graceful even, but unmistakable. To Emily it felt magnified, as if each movement was being broadcast to the entire church. Her father walked beside her, his pace steady, his arm a pillar of strength. But she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes, some filled with compassion, others with curiosity, and a few, though she didn't want to admit it, with pity. Whispers began to ripple quietly through the pews. "She's limping. Poor thing. I didn't think she'd walk. Shouldn't she have waited until she was better?" Each murmur was like a pinprick to her confidence. The walk she had practiced so many times suddenly felt longer, heavier. Her chest tightened. She could feel the tremor in her leg, the slight drag of her foot as the old injury reminded her of its presence. But still, she walked on. She focused on Jake. He stood tall at the altar, his face soft with love, eyes locked on hers. When their gazes met, a tiny smile flickered across his lips, and for a second, she felt like the only person in the room. The whispers faded, the ache dulled, until another wave of murmurs broke her focus. A child's voice whispered too loudly, "Mom, why is she walking funny?" The mother shushed him quickly. embarrassment flushing her face. But the damage was done. A few guests turned their heads. Others exchanged looks that were part sympathy, part discomfort. Emily's steps slowed. Her heart pounded louder than the music. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thick. Her father glanced at her, sensing her struggle, and leaned in gently. "You're doing beautifully," he whispered. "Just a little more, sweetheart." She nodded, blinking back tears that threatened to blur her vision. Her bouquet trembled again. Every step felt like a small act of defiance, against pain, against judgment, against the whispers that questioned whether she even belonged here in white. In the third row, an older woman clutched her pearls and murmured to her neighbor, "I don't know if I could be that brave." Another replied softly, "Or that in love." Emily caught that just barely, and a flicker of warmth touched her heart. Not every whisper was cruel. Some were full of awe, of admiration. Some saw what this walk truly meant, not a limp but a triumph. Still, the tension in the room was palpable. Guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where to look. The music swelled, almost as if trying to cover the whispers that trailed behind her like shadows. Halfway down the aisle, Emily's leg began to tremble from the strain. Her father's grip tightened, steadying her. She smiled at him through the ache, trying to pretend the pain didn't matter. But when she stumbled slightly, just a small misstep, a collective gasp escaped the crowd. That sound, sharp and unified, pierced through her like a blade. She froze for half a heartbeat, her cheeks flushing. And then, before panic could take hold, she saw movement at the end of the aisle. Jake. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, 1, 2, 3 strides toward her. His eyes never left hers, his expression unreadable to everyone but her. And in that moment, the whispers stopped. The murmurs that had followed her every step faded into silence, replaced by something else. Anticipation. Emily's breath caught. She didn't know what he was about to do, but deep down she knew. This was the moment that would change everything. From the moment Jake saw the church doors open, he couldn't take his eyes off her. There she was, Emily, radiant and fragile all at once, her silhouette framed in sunlight. Her veil floated gently as she took her first step into the aisle, the soft rustle of her gown mingling with the distant hum of the organ. To him, she looked like a miracle, because she was one. But as she began her slow walk toward him, Jake noticed something else, the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hand gripping the bouquet, the way her father's arm bore most of her weight. And then he heard it, the faint, unmistakable ripple of whispers spreading through the church. It started small, a murmur here and there. But soon it filled the quiet spaces between the music, that sharp, uncomfortable sound of people talking when they shouldn't. Jake's stomach tightened. He could read the looks in their eyes, pity from some, discomfort from others. A few simply watched, curiosity plain on their faces. But none of them saw her the way he did. They didn't know what it had taken for her to be there. How many sleepless nights, how many tears, how much courage it took to walk again at all. To them, she was a limping bride. To him, she was the strongest person he had ever known. He remembered every step of her journey, the sterile hospital rooms filled with the beeping of machines, the smell of antiseptic, the pain that left her shaking as she tried to move her leg an inch. He remembered sitting beside her bed, watching her hide tears behind forced smiles. He had seen her break, heal, and rebuild herself from the ground up. And now, as she walked toward him, wobbling slightly, her chin lifted despite the whispers, he felt something swell inside his chest. It wasn't pity. It was awe. Still, seeing her falter made his heart ache. When she stumbled ever so slightly, the sharp intake of breath from the guests cut through him like glass. He wanted to shout, "Stop staring. Stop whispering. She's doing something braver than any of you could imagine." But instead, he stood there, frozen between pride and anger. The priest glanced at him, unsure of what was happening. The bridesmaids exchanged nervous looks. Even the music seemed to hesitate, the organist's fingers faltering for a brief second. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. His eyes never left hers, he could see it, the flicker of doubt crossing her face, the way her lips pressed together tightly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She was trying so hard to stay strong. She was fighting for every step. In that instant, Jake made a decision, one that wasn't planned, one that wasn't part of any rehearsal. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. One step, then another. Gasps rippled through the guests as he began walking down the aisle toward her. For a moment, confusion filled the air. The whispers stopped. Heads turned, but Jake didn't care about their reactions. The world could stare all it wanted. His only focus was Emily. When he reached her halfway down the aisle, she looked up in surprise, her eyes wide and wet. "Jake, what are you doing?" she whispered. He smiled gently, the corners of his mouth trembling with emotion. "Coming to get you," he said softly. Her father stepped aside, his throat tightening, a proud tear slipping down his cheek. Jake reached out his hand. Emily hesitated, then took it. His grip was firm, reassuring, unshakable. He could feel her trembling ease just slightly as she met his gaze. And in that moment, as the entire church watched in silence, Jake understood something deeper than love. It wasn't just about vows or ceremony. It was about showing up when the world whispered doubt. As they stood there side by side, the air seemed to shift. The whispers were gone, replaced by the heavy, reverent quiet that comes before something unforgettable. Jake knew what he had to do next. And before the ceremony was over, no one in that room would ever forget the way he silenced the world for the woman he loved. The moment Jake reached Emily, time seemed to pause. The faint hum of the organ faded into silence, and the only sound that remained was the soft rustle of her gown as she shifted her weight nervously. Every pair of eyes in the church was on them. Hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting to see what the groom was doing halfway down the aisle. Emily's heart raced. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected him to move, to break the invisible line between tradition and impulse. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Everyone's watching." "I know," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Let them." He reached for her bouquet and handed it gently to her father, then turned back to her. His eyes, warm, unwavering, full of the same love that had carried her through the hardest months of her life, met hers. "You've already walked far enough," he murmured, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. "Let me carry you the rest of the way." Before she could protest, before she could even comprehend what he was saying, Jake bent down and, with effortless tenderness, lifted her into his arms. The crowd gasped in unison. A few hands flew to mouths, others to hearts. The music stopped completely, the air thick with stunned silence. The only sound was the faint creak of his shoes on the marble floor as he began walking toward the altar, his bride cradled carefully against his chest. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Jake," she whispered, half laughing, half crying. "You don't have to." "I know," he interrupted gently. "But I want to." He walked slowly, deliberately, each step filled with quiet power. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, his expression calm. Not prideful, not boastful, but full of something pure and unshakable. Love. In his arms, Emily felt the world blur. The whispers that had pierced her confidence moments ago were gone. The faces that once seemed judgmental were now softened, tear-streaked, awestruck. Some guests began to cry openly. Even the priest at the altar blinked rapidly, his voice caught in his throat. Jake's arms were strong beneath her, steady, warm, grounding. Emily could feel the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her cheek. The moment felt unreal, like a dream she didn't dare to wake from. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly, her voice breaking. He looked down at her with that familiar, easy smile, the one that had made her fall in love with him years ago. "Because you've carried both of us long enough," he said simply. "It's my turn." The simplicity of his words broke her completely. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, blurring the golden glow of the candles and the faces of their guests into a haze of light and emotion. As Jake carried her down the final stretch of the aisle, people began to rise from their seats. Some clapped softly, others pressed their hands to their hearts. What had started as a moment of shock transformed into something sacred, a collective understanding of what love truly meant. When they reached the altar, Jake gently set Emily down on her feet. She wobbled slightly, but he held her steady, one arm wrapped securely around her waist. She laughed through her tears. The priest smiled faintly, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered, "I think that may be the most beautiful procession I've ever seen." Emily looked out over the sea of faces. The eyes that once pitied her now shone with admiration. There were no more whispers, no more judgment, only silence and reverence. She turned to Jake and whispered, "You just silenced an entire church." He smiled again, brushing a tear from her cheek. "No," he said softly. "You did. I just helped them see it." In that moment, standing together before the altar, surrounded by the quiet awe of everyone who had doubted her, Emily realized something profound. True love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about walking flawlessly down the aisle. It was about being carried, not because you're weak, but because someone loves you enough to lift you when the world forgets your strength. And as the ceremony continued, that single, unexpected gesture lingered in the hearts of everyone present, a story of love so powerful that even whispers couldn't survive it. The air inside the church was utterly still. For a long moment no one moved, no one breathed. It was as if time itself had stopped to honor what they had just witnessed. A groom carrying his bride down the aisle, not out of tradition but out of love so profound it silenced an entire room. Emily stood at the altar, her hand still clasped tightly in Jake's, her heart pounding in her chest. The echo of the whispers that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a quiet so complete it felt sacred. Every eye in the church was on them, but not in judgment now. Instead, their gazes were softened with awe, with tears, with something almost reverent. She looked around, dazed, her breath catching as she realized no one was whispering anymore. The same guests who had exchanged pitying looks when she limped through the door were now wiping their eyes. The same people who had murmured about her weakness were now watching in silent admiration. Even the children, who moments ago fidgeted and whispered too loudly, sat perfectly still, their wide eyes fixed on the bride who had turned her pain into strength. Jake's arm remained around her waist, his touch steady and reassuring. She leaned into him slightly, not because she needed support, though her legs still trembled from the effort, but because she wanted to be close to the man who had just changed everything. For months, she had feared this moment. She had pictured it over and over in her mind, stumbling, falling, seeing the disappointment in people's faces. But never, not once, had she imagined this. The whispers that haunted her dreams were gone. The shame she'd carried melted away. All that remained was love, raw, real, breathtaking love. The priest cleared his throat softly, his eyes glistening as he looked at the couple before him. "Well," he said with a gentle smile, "I believe we have already witnessed the most powerful vow of the day, without a single word spoken." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the pews, not mocking but warm, full of relief and joy. The tension that had gripped the room dissolved like mist, replaced by a collective sense of wonder. Jake turned to Emily, his hand brushing against her cheek. "You okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. She nodded, her eyes shining. "More than okay," she whispered back. "I think this is the first time I've ever felt seen for who I really am." He smiled, that small, tender smile she loved. "Good," he said softly, "because that's the only person I've ever loved." The priest signaled for the ceremony to continue, but the atmosphere was different now. Lighter, sacred. Every word spoken from then on, every vow, every promise, carried the weight of what they had already proven with their actions. When it came time to exchange vows, the silence in the church felt like a blessing. There were no more distractions, no more background noise. Just two people standing before everyone they loved, promising forever. Emily's voice trembled when she spoke. "Jake, you've seen me at my weakest," she said, her tone quiet but sure. "You've carried me, not just today, but through everything. You've loved me when I couldn't even love myself. I thought I'd lost everything that made me beautiful. But you showed me that real beauty isn't in how you walk, it's in how you love." A tear slipped down Jake's cheek as he squeezed her hands. "You've never stopped being beautiful," he replied. Not for a second. The audience sniffled softly. Some held hands. Others dabbed at their eyes. No one looked away. And though the church was full, Emily and Jake felt utterly alone in the best way. Two souls suspended in a moment of perfect silence, wrapped in something far greater than words. When the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, Jake leaned in and kissed her tenderly, reverently. The guests erupted, cheers, applause, even a few sobs. But it was the quiet that came afterward that Emily would always remember. That silence, that breathtaking golden silence, wasn't heavy anymore. It was peace. It was love filling every corner of the room, echoing in every heart. The silence that once came from judgment now came from reverence, and as they turned to walk back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Emily realized, she no longer heard her limp. All she could hear was the sound of love that had silenced the world. The ceremony had already been transformed. What began as a moment filled with curiosity and quiet judgment had become something holy, something that would live in every guest's memory long after the music stopped. Yet, as the time came for Jake and Emily to speak their vows, the air grew still again. The priest gave a gentle nod, stepping back slightly, his kind eyes glimmering with emotion. The faint sound of birds drifted through the open church windows. Candles flickered. The world outside seemed to pause, waiting to hear what love sounded like after everything it had endured. Emily went first. Her bouquet had been set aside. Her hands trembled slightly in Jake's. The lace sleeve of her gown brushed against his wrist, and for a moment she closed her eyes, steadying herself. She took a breath. "Jake," she began, her voice soft but clear. "When I woke up in that hospital bed, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything. My strength, my confidence, my future. But then you walked in with that ridiculous smile, carrying flowers and pretending everything was fine." The crowd chuckled gently. Emily smiled too, her eyes shimmering. "You never let me believe I was broken. Even when I couldn't walk, you made me feel like I could fly. You loved me when I was angry, when I was scared, when I was pushing you away. You didn't give up on me, not once." Jake's grip on her hands tightened. He blinked quickly, trying to hold back the emotion threatening to spill over. Emily's voice wavered but grew stronger with every word. "So today, in front of everyone we love, I promise you this. I will never let fear stop me again. I will keep walking, even if I limp, even if it's hard, because every step brings me closer to you. And when you stumble, I'll be there too. That's what love means to me now. Not perfection, just perseverance, together." A quiet sniffle came from somewhere in the front row. A bridesmaid wiped at her eyes. Even the priest seemed to swallow hard, blinking away tears. Jake took a deep breath. For a second, he couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too heavy. But when he finally did, his voice was steady, rich with emotion. "Emily," he said, his tone gentle but sure. "I used to think love was about finding the perfect person, the one who completes you. But then I met you and I realized love isn't about perfection. It's about devotion." He paused, his eyes locked on hers. "I saw you fight through pain most people couldn't even imagine. You taught me what strength really looks like. You made me understand that marriage isn't walking side by side only when the road is easy. It's carrying each other when the ground gives way." His voice deepened as he continued, every word sinking into the hearts of those listening. "So I promise you this. I don't care if you limp, crawl, or fall. I'll walk beside you every day that I can, and when you can't walk, I'll carry you. Just like today. Because love isn't about how far we go. It's about how we get there, together." A hush fell over the room. Even the candles seemed to burn more brightly in the stillness. Tears streamed freely down Emily's cheeks, and for a moment she couldn't speak. She simply nodded, smiling through the ache in her chest. Jake reached up and brushed away one of her tears with his thumb, his touch as gentle as his words. Then, as if by instinct, the guests began to rise, not to leave, not to cheer, but to stand in quiet respect. The priest, his voice trembling with warmth, said softly, "If that isn't a sacred vow, I don't know what is." In that instant, everyone in the church, every skeptic, every whisperer, every heart in the room had felt something shift. They had come to witness a wedding. But what they saw was something far greater, a love story that redefined what vows were meant to be. Not words spoken in comfort, but promises forged in pain and proven in action. And as Jake and Emily looked into each other's eyes, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them again. Two souls who had found, against every odd, the kind of love that changes everything. When the ceremony ended, the church erupted into applause, and not the loud, casual kind people give at weddings, but something deeper, something that came from the heart. Every hand that clapped carried emotion. Every cheer was soaked in tears. The guests weren't just celebrating a marriage. They were celebrating something rare, a love that had silenced judgment and redefined strength. Emily stood beside Jake, her hand still trembling in his. Her veil was slightly out of place, her eyes red from crying, but she had never looked more radiant. The fear that had shadowed her when she entered the church was gone. She felt light, unburdened. For the first time since her accident, she wasn't thinking about how she walked, how she looked, or how others saw her. She was simply there, loved, seen, and free. As the newlyweds turned to face the crowd, a hush fell again. Then, one by one, people rose to their feet, clapping softly at first, then louder until the sound filled every corner of the church. Tears glistened in every eye. Even those who had whispered earlier, the ones who had questioned, pitied, or judged, now stood in awe. The priest smiled gently. "True love," he said, "does not need witnesses, but I'm glad we were all here to see it." Jake leaned toward Emily, his lips close to her ear. "Told you they'd be speechless," he teased, his tone light, breaking through the wave of emotion. She laughed softly, her heart full. "You didn't silence them," she whispered back. "We did." Outside, the sun bathed the steps of the church in warm light. As they stepped through the doors together, Emily could feel the gentle breeze lifting her veil, wrapping around them like a blessing. Cameras clicked, confetti fluttered through the air, and friends cheered Aggie, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on Jake, whose hand never once let go of hers. When they reached the car waiting to take them to the reception, Emily hesitated. "You know," she said with a playful smile, "you didn't have to carry me earlier. I was going to make it." Jake grinned, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know, but you've carried me in other ways since the day I met you. It was my turn to return the favor." Her laughter mixed with tears. "Then I guess we're even." "No," he said softly, pulling her close. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to catch up." As the car pulled away, the guests watched them go. Two figures framed against the golden afternoon light, waving through the open window. For a long while, no one moved. The older woman in the front pew dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "I thought I came for a wedding," she murmured, "but I think I just witnessed faith in human form." Word of the moment spread fast. By evening, someone had uploaded the video to social media, the image of Jake carrying Emily down the aisle, her veil fluttering, the crowd silent in awe. Within hours, it began to circulate, shared with captions like, "This is what real love looks like." Strangers from around the world commented, sending blessings, tears, and admiration. But for Emily, none of that mattered as much as the simple truth she carried in her heart, that Jake's love had healed something far deeper than her limp. Weeks later, when they watched the video together at home, Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to think people would only remember how I walked," she said softly. Jake kissed the top of her head. "They won't remember the limp," he said. "They'll remember the love." She smiled, eyes glistening. "So will I." And she was right. Because years later, long after the wedding flowers had faded and the whispers of that day had turned into legend, people would still talk about it. About the bride who limped down the aisle, about the groom who met her halfway, and about how in one unforgettable moment love carried them both and silenced the world.